Morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this hybrid seminar of the Liberalism Study Program at the IRIS at the George Washington University. We are today hybrid, both in person and online, and we are welcoming you for a great discussion on trajectories of post-communist regimes, a comparative framework. Our speaker, whom I will be presenting in a few seconds, and I decided to slightly change the topic given the current situation in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we thought it would be good to move away from the previous discussion we had planned on populism and go back to a discussion on the trajectory of post-communist regimes. But of course, there are links we could be discussing on between this trajectory of post-communist regime and the notion of populism and illiberalism. So let me say a few words. We're very happy to have here in Washington, D.C., our colleague Bálint Madlovics, who is working at the CEU Democracy Institute and who will be presenting a research he has been doing with, and we have here one of the copy of the book, the original manuscript, let me showing to you. A book he has been written with his colleague Bálint Magyar called The Anatomy of Post-Communist Regime, a conceptual framework that has been just published in 2020 by Central European University Press. So I will now give the floor to Bálint, and then after for the Q&A, we can have both questions from the in-person room and from the online room. So you will be able, for those of you who are online, to use the chat room for discussion. Bálint, welcome, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I can be seen. Okay. So thank you very much for this lovely introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Let me just try to put this full screen. Okay. So first of all, let me also so excuse me for the last minute change of the topic. Perhaps some of you were expecting populism and how I talk about populism as a challenge to liberal democracy. But I thought, and as Marlene already said, so we agreed that perhaps with the invasion of Ukraine going on, there are perhaps more timely topics now than populism and Trump. So, and one of the most timely topics now perhaps is the trajectories of post-communist regimes. So how those countries which emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union, including Russia and Ukraine, have developed in the last 30 years. Now, I give a subtitle to this talk, which is a comparative framework. And that means that I'm not just going to be talking about the history of these countries, but I would like to give you a comparative framework, a theoretical framework of interpretation. Basically, I'd like to give you some ideas on how to think about these regimes when you're looking at them, and how to interpret the processes within and among post-communist regimes in the first place. So, the general frame of interpretation for post-communist regimes when they first came into being was transitology. And transitology was built on two illusions. First, the illusion of linear progress toward liberal democracies, and the illusion that any regime can be built on any kind of ruins of communist dictatorships. So the general idea was that we are now in the 1990s, and the general idea was that now here are a bunch of countries which are now free. They are no longer under dictatorial oppression. And of course, they are not perfect democracies at the moment, but they are going to be. Now they are finally on the right track. Now they are on the right side of history, as Francis Fukuyama would say. So, and therefore, everything we see in the region are just transitional systems. Of course, the road to liberal democracy is not an easy one. Of course, there are difficulties along the road. And transitology was mainly interested in this, analyzing how these hindrances and how these, as they would put it, teething problems or childhood diseases are overcome as the countries are trying to progress toward liberal democracy. So that was the general framework in the 1990s that was challenged already around the turn of the millennium. When scholars realized that perhaps what they believed to be transitional systems might as well be terminal stations. And that was the point when in the literature, transitology was replaced by hybridology. So that was the point when the idea, so the whole interpretative framework of post-communist regimes changed. The new framework was that there is a democracy dictatorship axis with two polar type regimes. There is liberal democracy on the one hand, which is basically the Western type free and fair system. And on the other hand, or on the other pole, you have the overtly oppressive classical dictatorship. And between the two, there is a wide gray zone, different kinds of regimes which might progress toward one end or the other, but they need not to. So this is the real advancement or advantage of hybridology over transitology, that it rejected the presumption or axiom or illusion of linear progress toward liberal democracy. And instead it realized that these regimes might as well sit on specific equilibria, that they might indeed be independent systems, stable independent systems in the sense that they are neither democracies nor dictatorships. Then of course, what are they? They are most generally hybrid regimes, that's how they are called, but there are more elaborate conceptualizations like this one, which says that between liberal democracy and closed authoritarianism, there is, or closed authoritarianism is basically a classical dictatorship. So between them, there is electoral democracy, competitive authoritarianism, and hegemonic authoritarianism. Then we have another conceptualization here, which says that, perhaps it's better. Okay, so we have the third conceptualization by Hungarian economist János Kornai, who provides us three ideal types, three models of democracy, autocracy, and dictatorship. And he argues that we should be using these models as points of reference when describing actual countries and actual regimes. But these are really just some of the categories. If you look into this, to this table, and especially the middle column, you will see that there has really been a proliferation of political regime categories in the last 20 years. Just some of the names which you can see for hybrid regimes like delegative democracy, illiberal democracy, managed democracy, semi-democracy, or from the other pole, you can have competitive authoritarianism, electoral authoritarianism, liberal autocracy, and many other terms which have been developed for these neither democracy nor dictatorship regimes. And this is basically now the mainstream comparative paradigm. This is how post-communist regimes are generally understood as stable systems, hybrid regimes on this democracy dictatorship axis. Now, in this book, The Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes, I co-authored with Bálint Magyar, in this we try to challenge this paradigm because we believe that there are some problems in it. And the most general problem with this hybrid regimes idea is that it changed the regime labels, but it didn't change the regime framework. So it introduced a lot of new labels, a lot of new terms for how these regimes should be called, but still when it comes to describing their elements, it comes to describing their components, they are still using the terms taken from Western liberal democracies. They are still talking about politicians, parties, governments, parliaments, checks and balances, all those categories which are very much applicable in, or they are very apt in Western regimes, but they might not work that well in post-communist contexts. And that is because the use of language, the use of these categories brings in hidden axioms. This language carries hidden axioms that are in our thinking when we are talking about post-communist regimes, but which need to be dissolved if we are to understand how they actually work. Here are just three of these axioms. The first axiom is that the separation of spheres of social action is completed. That meaning that the political, economic, and communal spheres are separate, and which means that basically they are autonomous, that they have autonomy. That the political logic, there is separate political logic, and there is separate economic logic. Because consider, for instance, perhaps as a counterexample, you would first say lobbying. Lobbying in liberal democracies, which is a very common phenomenon, and perhaps someone would argue that it actually represents a lack of separation of spheres of social action, but because there's a connection between political and economic spheres there. But if you think about it, what happens there is that the politician receives campaign contribution, so he receives something he can use in the political machinery, and the entrepreneur receives favorable regulation, which he can use to be more profitable. So we have a political actor with political motives who gets political gain or political benefit, and we have an economic actor with economic motives who receives economic benefits. So both actors in the lobbying relation strive to solidify their elite position in their own sphere of social action. So the politician doesn't become an entrepreneur, the entrepreneur doesn't become a politician. This is what the separation of spheres of social action means. And this is what's totally not the case in many post-communist regimes, because in post-communist regimes, very often what we see is that the ruling elites are, in fact, composed of informal patronal networks, that it is not the parties that rule, that it is not the politicians themselves that they rule as such, as politicians, but there are informal patronal networks, political economic clans, which of course involve some people with formal positions like very often the head of executive, president, prime minister, many people who are directly below him in the party hierarchy, but it also involves people who are formerly independent branches of power, like the judiciary, like people in the chief prosecutor, and the network also involves many people in the economic sphere who are formerly independent, but informally they are dependent on the head of executive, who is the chief patron of the informal patronal network, like oligarchs and other kind of people. And these informal patronal networks, they are driven by the twin motives of power concentration and wealth accumulation. Power concentration and wealth accumulation, which precisely means that there is no separate political and economic logic, that the two are in fact connected and they cannot really be separated or detached from each other, because they are really, as I said, the twin motives of these informal patronal networks which constitute the elites, the ruling elite in post-communist regimes. So that's the first one. The second one is that, or the second axiom to be resolved, is that the de jure position of persons and institutions coincide with the de facto position. And here's where the language comes in, because very often it is very customary to speak about Vladimir Putin or Tokayev in Kazakhstan or Viktor Orban in Hungary as presidents or prime ministers, because as they are. But when we are saying that they are presidents and prime ministers, what we are really doing is that we're trying to define them by their de jure position, their formal position. Now, defining someone by their formal position makes total sense in a Western context. It makes total sense to speak about Joe Biden or Emmanuel Macron as presidents. Why? Because the president means that the president has formally defined competencies and powers and formally defined limits. Now, those people I just mentioned, they are presidents and they have those powers which are vested in the position of the president, and they have those limits, those constitutional limits. In their case, the legal position coincides with sociological reality. But what if that's not the case? Because in the case of Putin and in the case of Orban, they can actually step over their formal competencies. They can exert influence beyond their formal competencies and use power, for instance, over formerly independent economic actors, and not just regulate them as a normal state would regulate, but to mete out discretional rewards and punishments, targeted rewards and punishments to certain economic actors, and to use state power to basically reward and punish anyone they choose to do so. That's one of the key elements, how this informal patronal network, this kind of hierarchy of patron-client dependencies is maintained. And of course, that means that the de facto position, the de facto powers that these actors have, is actually vastly superior to what they have on paper. So they. The third point, the third axiom, is that the state is an actor pursuing the common good, and that public policy mistakes or corruption cases are not system-constituting elements, but simple deviances. So the general idea here is that the state wants people to respect the laws. They create the laws to regulate people's lives. And if people circumvent the laws and they commit corruption, that is against the will of the central government. The central government tries to, or the government, any kind of government tries to eliminate corruption in pursuit of effective governmentality. Also, if you look into corruption in the corruption literature, you will very often find that corruption is explained as a result of a deficient legal framework. So that there are loopholes in the framework, and dishonest public or private actors can use those loopholes. So opportunity makes the thief. That's the general idea of corruption in the corruption literature. But what if it's the other way around? What if not opportunity makes the thief, but the thief makes the opportunity? What if it is the central government that creates the laws and creates regulations precisely to carry out corruption? What if corruption is not bottom-up bribery, What if it's not a disorganized action of many private actors bribing politicians and public actors, but it is a centrally organized function? When corruption is organized from the top, that's very often the case when the country is run by an informal patronal network driven by the motives of power concentration and wealth accumulation. So this is something we have to bear in mind when we are focusing on post-communist regimes. And if we take these, let me say, sociological insights into consideration, we can expand the democracy dictatorship axis. And here is the comparative framework. The democracy dictatorship axis, the classical of the mainstream comparative paradigm, we keep it right up here on the top of the triangle. So the top of the triangle, we have democracy, liberal democracy, and we also have communist dictatorship, which is the classical dictatorship. But we can expand this. This axis into a triangle by basically doubling the categories of democracy, autocracy, and dictatorship. So now we have 2 democracies, 2 autocracies, and 2 dictatorships. We have liberal democracy, which is a free and fair system, which is the normal Western type liberal democracy, where party competition is in fact the competition of parties confined to the political sphere. And that can be appreciated really when it's compared to patronal democracy, because in patronal democracy, what seems to be the competition of parties, it is in fact the competition of patron-client networks, of these political economic clans which use the parties to basically to channel illegitimate interests into the legitimate realm of political decision-making. So that is why they are using the parties, so to channel their illegitimate interests into the legitimate realm of political decision-making. In a patronal democracy, that's a democracy, we call it a democracy, and you can see this type is quite numerous, or quite, it appears quite often among post-communist regimes like Romania, Macedonia, Ukraine before the war, of course, Moldova, Georgia, so Slovakia, Bulgaria, and many other countries as well. So, and we call them democracies because there are multiple patron-client networks. There is not just one network, but there are multiple networks competing against each other. It's a multi-pyramid patronal network, or a competing pyramid configuration, as Hungary would say. So, and this is a case, and this can be stable in a sense if the networks are of roughly the equal size, and no network can become dominant, because all of them want to become dominant. All of them are driven by the motives of power concentration and wealth accumulation. So all of them want to marginalize the others, or liquidate them, or co-opt them. But in a patronal democracy, they cannot do that. No network is dominant, and therefore the system can remain, can basically not very stable, but it can be in a kind of dynamic equilibrium. But if there is one network, if it's not a multi-pyramid patronal network, but a single pyramid one, then we are talking about a patronal autocracy, where there is one dominant network, and that dominant network basically marginalizes, subordinates, or liquidates the other networks, and basically eliminates the autonomies in the society, in all the political, economic, and communal realms. That's the patronal autocracy model, and that's the model of Russia, Kazakhstan, as well as Hungary. Now, conservative autocracy, So conservative autocracy, that's the other type of autocracy, which is considerably different from the patronal one, because it is autocratic with respect to politics, with respect to the political level. It tries to eliminate the separation of branches of power, and it wants to expand its power over the state and exceed its constitutional limits. But it practically leaves the economy alone. It doesn't use that power to build up oligarchs, for example, or to support a new layer of owners. And this is the real difference between the case of Hungary and Poland. The case of Hungary and Poland, those two, in the mainstream literature, they are very often put together as the two examples of two autocracies or autocratic attempts within the European Union. This is how they are usually discussed together, Orbán's Hungary and Kaczynski's Poland. But, and indeed, if you think within the framework of the democracy dictatorship axis, it makes a lot of sense, because if you just pushed all these dots up to the top axis, you would find that Poland and Hungary are somehow, they are somehow close to each other. So so Hungary would be somewhere here, Poland somewhere there. I'm sorry for those who are watching the line. So they just need to imagine. So the two would be quite close to each other. The interpretation would be that, okay, Hungary is somewhat more authoritarian than Poland, but they both deviate from the liberal democratic model toward a more oppressive. And that's what you normally read. But if you expand that into a triangle, you will immediately see that they are very, very much different, because in Poland, Kaczynski doesn't have oligarchs. He doesn't use the state power that he had for basically to centrally organize corruption, whereas Orban uses his state power to do that, as well as Putin and Nazarbayev or Tokayev now in Kazakhstan. About dictatorship, we have the two types of dictatorship, which are, first of all, the communist one, which is the classical dictatorship, as I said, and they also have market exploiting dictatorship. That's the kind of dictatorship where the one-party system remains. So that's the main characteristic of a dictatorship. But while in communist dictatorship, this one-party system was accompanied by the monopoly of state property, that feature is given up in market exploiting dictatorship. So basically, the market entrepreneurship is set free. It's set free in a sense that a new layer of owners is allowed to emerge outside the party-state network, and that's the general case of China. That's the general case of China, this market exploiting dictatorship. Now, as you can see, a lot of countries are placed in this triangle, and they are scattered all over it. And you might ask why certain countries are put where they are put. Why Romania is right there, and the Ukraine is somewhere below. So what's the logic? And this triangle can be used, and countries can be placed in this triangle if you start dividing it up by different dimensions, by different features. For instance, you can divide it up by the feature of hybrid regime type. And here I incorporate the insights of hybridology into this triangular model, because we don't say that the concept of competitive authoritarianism, for example, is a wrong concept. It is not a wrong concept. It's just an overgeneralizing concept. It is a good concept to express that you have multi-party elections, and the elections, so the opposition can win those elections, but they are not free and fair, and there are no strong constitutional limits on the power holders. So these features are well expressed in competitive authoritarianism, but this can be true while you are closer to conservative autocracy or closer to a patronal kind of regime. So when you say competitive authoritarianism, it indeed means a whole range of different kinds of regimes which can be in that section. And if you want to decide where to put your country, if you recognize it as a competitive authoritarian, you can go to other dimensions, such as patronalism of rule. Now you need to imagine these triangles, they are put on top of each other. So we had competitive authoritarianism here, and now we have patronalism. So competitive authoritarianism will be somewhere here. Sorry once again from those who are watching from online. So the point is that in the competitive authoritarianism section, there are non-patronal systems and informal patronal systems. And that's where you need to decide whether it is a competitive authoritarian regime led by a ruling elite, which is a political economic clan, or not. Ruling parties function. It's once again a very important dimension. And this really much relates to the de facto and de jure positions that I was talking about. So it is also very customary to talk about, in Hungary, for instance, that the party Fidesz, Orbán's party, the Fidesz party decided on this, or there are Fidesz loyalists everywhere, or the United Russia party in Russia decided this or that, and there are party loyalists everywhere. Now, in fact, it is not the party that makes the decisions, because the party is a formal organization, and decision-making is taken out of formal decision-making bodies. If you just think about just most recently, right before the invasion of Ukraine, when there was this meeting of the Security Council, which was televised, and it was broadcast. Presumably, it was a live broadcast, but then it turned out that it wasn't. So, but in the broadcast of the Security Council, which should be formally the top decision-making body of Russia, with many of the key decision makers, including Putin and the prime minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Military and the heads of the main secret services. There, in that video, what you could see is not a collective decision making, not an actual collective decision making, but there was Putin who made the decision and the others pledged loyalty to him. So basically, what they did to express their loyalty, and that was so very clear from that video, and that is an example precisely for that in a system like this, in a patronal autocracy, the real decisions are not collective but personal decisions, and the real decisions are taken out of the formal bodies. They are made outside the formal bodies, and the formal bodies, including the party itself, are just transition belt organizations. The party itself is just a transition belt. It just exercises, it just executes the decisions made outside of the formal bodies by informal bodies and in informal circles. About the economy, because this model that we developed, I was mainly talking about the political sphere, so mainly about democracy and autocracy and stuff like that. But in this model, as we recognize that the spheres of social action are not separated, we also recognize, and that's why this book is so huge, because we recognize that we also need to deal somehow with the economy and with society. And when we are talking about the economy, we can make the following comparative differentiation. In a liberal democracy, you have market coordination and private property, the dominance of it. So, and by the way, all these sections, they refer to dominance, not totality. So, of course, even in a liberal democracy, some parts of the economy are not private, public, and it's not pure market coordination, but it's regulated, etc., and so on and so forth. So that is very common, of course. But if you look at the main mechanism that drives the system, or the dominant mechanism, that would be market coordination in liberal democracy, based on the dominance of private property. Now, if you compare communist dictatorship and patronal autocracy, they both have, their economies both have some kind of redistribution. In the case of communist dictatorship, you have bureaucratic resource distribution. Which means that, first of all, it's bureaucratic. There is a party, there is a central planning board, central planning body, and that decides, first of all, the ownership structure, who should be running the certain companies or certain units of the state, because everything's state-owned. And they also decide on what should be produced. So there are central plans and central plans with physical targets. Central planning with physical targets. That's what's happening in a communist dictatorship, and that's bureaucratic resource distribution based on the dominance of state property. In a patronal autocracy, however, you don't have bureaucratic resource distribution, but relational market redistribution. They no longer determine the production structure, but they determine the ownership structure. What they are interested in is to relocate property and companies from disloyal owners to loyal owners, to those owners who are clients in this patron-client network. And basically to eliminate either a disloyal or just simply outsider autonomous resources and economic actors, and to basically patronize everything in the single pyramid patronal network. Hence, we call this relational market redistribution, the redistribution of markets, and we call this kind of economy a relational economy. And we have a lot of more. We have, I believe, 11 or 12 such dimensions, but I don't have time to talk about all of them. But just the last one that I like to show you, because this might be important, and that is the autonomy of civil society. And by civil society, in the book, we understood it. We understand it in an expansive way. So in civil society, we include not just NGOs; those are included, of course, very important. But we also included the media. We also included in this group the entrepreneurs. So those people who have autonomous resources, autonomous from the central power, from the informal patronal network, and we included the citizens themselves with civil liberties. So these four groups, the media, the entrepreneurs, the NGOs, and the citizens, they form civil society in our understanding. And we group them together because that it is their freedom that can provide the ground from which an effective opposition can grow. They can provide, they can have, if they are free, they can have the autonomy to actually create a potent opposition to the existing network. Now, in a liberal democracy and even in a patronal democracy, they are partly free. In a liberal democracy, they're totally free. Patronal democracy, they are still somewhat free because there is not a single pyramid patronal network. In a patronal autocracy, these autonomies exist, but they are subjugated. So, to be more precise, these groups exist. So these civil society groups of NGOs and everyone, the media and the opposition, civil actors, they exist, but they are subjugated. Their autonomies are broken so that they cannot form an effective opposition. That's the main idea of a patronal autocracy, to neutralize these groups practically. And in a communist dictatorship, these groups are practically non-existent. So everything is subordinated to the state party itself. Now, putting these triangles on top of each other can help you to pinpoint a regime at a certain point in a certain time, because of course that can only refer to a certain status or a certain situation. But if the country changes, if the regime changes, then a country can be assigned another point. And I'll be showing you actual countries and actual trajectories in the triangle just in a moment. Because this is how you can actually use this model to model the trajectories of post-communist regimes. So you can model as they start from communist dictatorship and as they are moving toward different points within the triangle. And here are just 4 ideal typical trajectories, which we call primary trajectories. And these are the primary trajectories, meaning that the first station or first step after the collapse of the communist system. Because all of these countries basically start from the communist dictatorship, different types of it, of course, but generally from this regime type. There is the first one is a kind of regime change, which we experienced in Estonia, Poland, or Hungary, when from a communist dictatorship, the country changed to liberal democracy. So from a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal system, there was a change to a multi-pyramid non-patronal system. That's the first type. The second type is what we saw in the case of Romania or Ukraine, where communist dictatorship was changed to patronal democracy. So from a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal system to a multi-pyramid informal patronal system. So it never changed to a non-patronal liberal democracy that Poland or Estonia was. But they started out as informal patronal systems, although multi-pyramid and therefore democracies. Now, third type, that's the C type, which is the regime change, where communist dictatorship is changed to patronal autocracy, where single pyramid bureaucratic patronal system is changed to a single pyramid but informal patronal system. And the final one is just a model change, where single pyramid bureaucratic patronal system is changed to another single pyramid bureaucratic patronal one. That's why it's only a model change. And that's when communist dictatorship changes to market exploiting dictatorship, as in the case of China. And let me just show you now, and I'm trying to, just a second. I hope everyone can see now the triangles. I changed the share screening, so I believe that now it's, yeah, okay, fine, great. So because what I just showed you, that was so two-dimensional. So let me change to three-dimensional. We have this 3D model of the triangles, and they are put on top of each other, just like I said. And this model can be used, so this can be used to actually model the trajectories of post-communist regimes, such as Estonia. It starts out as part of the Soviet Union, of course. Then the Soviet Union starts to loosen up, and it moves a little bit downwards, but then it changes to liberal democracy, and it practically remains there. Of course, there's a lot of internal dynamics in Estonia. Government changes, and new parties coming up, and everything. But those don't mean regime level change, and therefore it remains at a stable point since 1990, 1991, 1992. There's some confusion in the dates there. This is an old version of the triangle. I'm sorry about that. We are trying to update it, but anyway. So Estonia practically represents the first type of primary trajectory, the change from communist dictatorship to liberal democracy. Romania is this kind of trajectory, or has this kind of trajectory, which changes from communist dictatorship to patronal democracy. And it is not as stable as a liberal democracy because, as I said, in a patronal democracy, all the networks are trying to concentrate power, and all of them try to eliminate the others, and all of them try to practically break the logic of democracy. All of them want to be single pyramids. And therefore, the system is in constant movement. The system is in constant movement, but as no network is strong enough to actually institute a single pyramid patronal network or to create a single pyramid, therefore the country basically just rotates around or oscillates around this patronal democracy model. That's what I refer to as a dynamic equilibrium instead of a stable equilibrium, which Estonia had. Kazakhstan, which starts from a communist dictatorship, and if not in one step, in two steps, it becomes a patronal autocracy already very early in the 1990s. So practically what really happens is that then Nazarbayev in 1994 gets basically he's able to consolidate his power in a way. So he is able to build this single pyramid patronal network. And since then, the country has been there. Really, that now, like a month ago or something, there was a revolution in Kazakhstan, or it looked like a revolution. I would argue that it's more an internal an elite change, an internal elite change, because Nazarbayev resigned a few years ago because he's too old, and he was trying to give to give up his power in a gradual way. So he had to solve the problem of succession, which all these autocrats have to solve somehow, because they create their systems for eternity, but they are not immortal. So they have to solve this problem of what to do the system after they get so old. And then Nazarbayev tried to do this in a gradual way, that he would step back gradually and give the power to Tokayev, his successor, who he believed to be loyal. But eventually it turned out, as far as I know, that, or as far as I can understand, that it was this kind of revolution, which actually seems to be a revolution of the people, is very much, it very much has Tokayev and all of the anti-Nazarbayev people behind it. So therefore, the country doesn't really change from a patronal autocracy to another system, but rather it represents a change on the top leadership of the single pyramid patronal network. So that the patronal network is now not loyal to Nazarbayev, who I believe fled from the country, but it is now loyal to Tokayev. Okay, and China, which of course never moved to any of the democracies or even the autocracies, but it moved to market exploiting dictatorship. Okay, now let me show you some of the secondary trajectories. Secondary trajectories meaning those countries which moved, which had a primary trajectory, of course. They had a first step after communism, but they changed, there was some regime change after that. So there was a secondary change happening after communist dictatorship, such as in the case of the Czech Republic. If I had that's good. Okay, Czech Republic. No, sorry. No, I didn't mean to do this. Just a second. Sorry. I'm sorry, it's a little bit slow, but eventually it will work. Okay. So, although the Czech Republic was among those countries which changed from communist dictatorship to liberal democracy, there was under Babiš, under the leadership of Andrej Babiš, that the country was trying to move, or rather he tried to move the country in a patronal direction. Basically, as he was practically a very wealthy man, he was an oligarch, and who got into top leadership, into top, to the head of the executive position. And that's a transformation of an oligarch into a polygarch, as we call it in the book. So an actor who has not just economic power, but also political power, in this formal political power as well. So that's what Babiš did, and he tried to carry out a patronal transformation, to create from a multi-pyramid non-patronal system. He tried to create a patronal system. But in the Czech Republic, the civil society is very strong. It's extremely strong. And therefore, basically, they were able to defeat Babiš. I'm hearing now that Babiš might be coming back, so there will be some elections coming up, and he wants to run for president, I believe. So he might not be out of the game now. But it seems that his attempt at changing democracy, or changing liberal democracy into a patronal democracy, or to carrying out this patronal transformation, that was hard. That was stopped. Now, in the case of, and let me now. So that was an unsuccessful attempt. Now let me talk about a successful attempt at patronalization, and that is the case of Hungary. And then in the case of Hungary. Now, in the case of Hungary, Hungary has probably the longest trajectory in the post-communist region. It starts as a communist dictatorship, of course, but in 1968, there was an economic reform, which was called the New Economic Mechanism, which basically pushed the country toward a market exploiting dictatorship way. So it tried to push the country in a Chinese direction. Actually, there were Chinese scholars who came to Hungary before the regime change, and they were trying to figure out how this works, how a market system can be made functional under the control of the Communist Party. So they were very much interested in the Hungarian experience. But Hungary didn't go all the way down the Chinese way, but the regime change happened, and it became a liberal democracy. But then 1998 happened, and in 1998, Viktor Orbán first got into power. And already in his first government, he tried, just like Babiš now, or rather before he was defeated. So Orbán tried to carry out a patronal transformation, and that practically he did. He practically started with his informal patronal network, with his political economic clan. He started to occupy various positions in the state machinery, and in the economy as well. Why he wasn't successful at the time is that because he didn't have a constitutional majority. He didn't have a constitutional majority. In Hungary, you need, just very briefly now, so he didn't have a constitutional majority, which he had, or which he won in 2010. And in 2010, then he had the raw political power to change the constitution, the electoral law, and basically to institute the single pyramid patronal network. In the case of Russia, it happened in 2003 when Putin got the power, the raw political power to basically change the patron-client relationship between oligarchs being the patrons and the political actors being the clients. He changed that relationship into him being the patron and the oligarchs being the clients. And finally, in the case of Ukraine, which is once again a patronal democracy. But it's a patronal democracy, and it's just like in the case of Romania, it's in a dynamic equilibrium, but it has with a much larger amplitude. So the amplitudes are much larger, and the amplitudes basically refer to the color revolutions that happened in the case of Ukraine, which were believed to lead to liberal democracy, but in fact they were not accompanied by anti-patronal transformations. So they were not accompanied by anti-patronal transformations, and therefore, when the autocratic attempt was stopped by the color revolution, what happened afterwards was not going to liberal democracy, but going back to the normal state of affairs of patronal democracy. And that's how Ukraine, of course, this is all before the war and all before the invasion, but before that, Ukraine was this case of a patronal democracy moving with wide amplitudes around the patronal democracy. So yeah, this is the comparative framework. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Bálint. That was really just, I think, the most comprehensive approach I ever seen on that question. And when I was listening to you, I was dreaming, seeing the same kind of three-dimensional map for the notion of populism. And that would be because it's also a big conceptual kind of a mess. So that would be really wonderful. We have like 15 minutes for Q&A. I invite people who are in the virtual room to raise their virtual hand, and we are happy to give them the floor to read their question. And we have also people in the room. So I would like to give you the floor. Yeah, you will have to talk very loudly to be sure people will be hearing you. Oh, we have microphones even. Yes. Bálint, you coming back here? You can introduce yourself.
Okay. Hello, my name is Uliana Movchan. I'm a Petrarch Fellow in Ukrainian Studies here in IRIS. Actually, I'm from Ukraine, from Kharkiv University. So I have questions regarding Ukraine. I mean, about the war consequences of patronal regime change in Ukraine. I mean, how many directions do you have? I mean, is there any possibility for liberal democracy, or with the danger of populism, this new wave of patronalism, even in a stable democracy? Yes, would we just go down to patronal autocracy? What is your opinion? I mean, any maybe case studies of how war consequences of patronalism?
Yes. In the case of Ukraine, there is a very nice case study, and that's written by Vladimir Dubrovsky and by Kana Mijay and other scholars, that's entitled 6 Years After the Revolution of Dignity. And that's a very nice study which analyzes precisely whether anti-patronal reforms were instituted. And they find that in Ukraine, there is a chance for that. Because, as they argue, there is a so-called creative middle class, a new creative middle class, which practically don't want to live under this kind of patronal system. And I believe the election of Zelensky, I believe it practically meant that it was a very good chance for the country to move to a less patronal direction. I mean, of course, this is never a very easy thing to do. Actually, within the post-communist region, there is just one country which was really successful in doing an anti-patronal transformation, and that was, if I have it here, that was Georgia. It was Georgia, which actually, after its color revolution, it managed to go up and really carry out, really reduce the level of patronalism in this country. But that required really extreme reforms of curtailing state power. So really abolishing altogether state institutions, which required that. And that's probably, they were willing to do it because they had this ideology-driven libertarian drive against the state, and therefore they were very eager to eliminate some state institutions. But it might not be this easy in the case of Ukraine or perhaps other countries. But this is perhaps the only model which we have, and I believe that when it comes to analysis, and I believe even in the case of Ukraine, the example of Saakashvili, and even I believe experts from the Saakashvili government were invited to Ukraine to advise and to explain what they did and how they could perhaps be implemented in Ukraine. So, and of course, everything I'm saying that was before the invasion. Now, who knows what will be the outcome? And of course, that even any kind of hope we had, now they might be broken. So we can't know, but there was hope at least.
We have a question coming on the chat from our colleague and PhD student here at GW, Julian Waller. I will read it. Your framework is really impressive and makes a lot of sense, especially by integrating Henry Herd's patronalist theory. One question I had was conceptual. Are you worried that you are overburnt different dimensions with multiple conceptual components in the same concept? That is, it's not electoral democracy, but liberal democracy that you point to. It's not electoral or hegemonic autocracy, authoritarianism, it's conservative autocracy. That is, there are ideological components perhaps built into a regime types framing. this may be fine in an ideal type sense, but are you concerned about building it too many distinct conceptual elements here?
Well, so the whole book, this book, The Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes, so the subtitle of it is a conceptual framework. So most of it is about the conceptualization of post-communist regimes. And we just believe that these 6 regime types and the triangular, this conceptual space they define, it is appropriate for the description of these trajectories. So I believe that it's not too much. And actually, yes, of course, we really just incorporated the ideas of hybridology and hybrid regime types to show how the two can be connected, to show that we are not rejecting everything the other political scientists did, because they did great work. Of course, they did great work in mapping out the machinery of politics in these regimes. And we use many of their insights in the book about elections and everything, and the political institutions, how they are changed, and so on and so forth. But we need to go beyond them. We need to go beyond them in a sense that we need categories which can be interpreted not only in this democracy dictatorship axis, but beyond them in this triangular conceptual space. We really try to be not just comprehensive, but also coherent. So we try to define our concepts in a coherent way. And well, of course, we are open to criticism, but I hope it makes sense, and I'm glad it does.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Kulina Sipkatulina. I'm also visiting scholar here at IRIS. My question, again, regarding your framework, to what extent it's applicable to analyze other hybrid regimes that are not post-communistic, so for example, Latin American, and also even liberal democracies that are now faltering or changing. So are there any limitations that we have to keep in mind when we think this?
Yeah. Well, that's a work in progress. Now, actually, we are working on expanding this model to Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. So now we are working on this. Actually, my co-author, Bálint Magyar, he started from describing Hungary only. And then we expanded that for the post-communist region. And now we are trying to expand it even further. As for Western regimes, well, if we really wanted to incorporate them in this model, then we would need to deal with a whole host of issues. For instance, the different types of the welfare state, for example, which we don't really discuss in the book, because that's not the real difference between patronal regimes and liberal regimes. That's really not the question here. The real question is whether you have informal patronal networks or not. So whether not just whether you have left-wing or right-wing parties, but it is whether the parties are actually focusing on public policies or they are focusing on power concentration and wealth accumulation. So that is the real difference, the real aspect you need to stress when you are trying to interpret these regimes. But of course, as you said, if we try to incorporate Western regimes, we would need to take into account other aspects as well. Now, the problem we see with expanding this framework is that, so I was talking about axioms that you need to dissolve from the Western understanding to understand post-communist regimes. Now, I believe there are axioms you need to dissolve from the post-communist understanding to understand the rest of the world. So in the case of post-communist regimes, we didn't consider, for instance, real failed states like Somalia. We didn't consider civil wars. We didn't consider theocracies. We didn't consider military dictatorships. We didn't consider puppet states. So there are many different kinds of states and regime types we didn't consider because we didn't have to. Only because as we were developing a conceptual framework only for post-communism, but as we are stepping outside of this region, we will need to incorporate those insights. And as I said, that's a work in progress.
Yeah, Henry Hale. So yeah, thank you once again for a really brilliant discussion. I guess I just have two questions, one very conceptual and one very concrete. There's the conceptual one is, I was just, as hearing you again, I was just trying to wrestle with why the triangle as opposed to just a standard kind of 2x2, two-dimensional kind of graph, like that kind of space. I wonder if you could talk about that. And then the other question is, I just wonder how, if you've given thought to this, how might Russia, what Russia is undergoing right now, be reflected in your concepts, right? I mean, with like the, kind of rapidly increasing, levels of repression, possible declaration of martial law. Maybe this isn't maybe what the framework's intended for, but I just wonder how you might think about it as it would be reflected in these concepts. Thank you.
Okay. So first about the conceptual issue, this is not what you need to see, that this is really not a graph, not a graph in a sense as a 2x2 graph would be. So when the distance is measured from, for instance, the patronal autocracy pole of the triangle, that doesn't mean the how should I say? So the sides, they don't just refer to single variables, because that's what a normal XY axis kind of graph would do, that you have the different axes, and as you are moving on them, you basically go on a certain aspect with certain quantities. So you have more of a certain quantity or less of it, and then you can add another aspect. Now, this triangle is not like that. It's not composed of such axes, but it is. It works by this quite unorthodox way. Sorry, I'm just trying to. Yeah. So it works by not. So when you place a regime into it, it doesn't work by saying that you have, I don't know, 3 units of patronalism, and then you put it on the patronalism axis, you put it on the 3rd unit, but you just recognize the fact that it is an informal patronal regime. Then you recognize the fact that it has, for instance, transmission of parties and everything, and then you place it in the triangle in those sections. And then, as those triangles are put on top of each other, as if you put down a needle in it, it creates this kind of conceptual coherence between the layers. So this is how really this is really a complete. It's a different conceptualization from a 2x2 axis model, because this is how we could actually incorporate more than 2 dimensions. So this is basically why we did it. So that because we needed something which goes beyond this, which goes beyond just the two features, but we needed more to be all comprehensive. Now, but the other question about Russia, what really needs to be seen at the moment is that is the difference between regime-specific features and country-specific features. So that because these triangles, they are defined by regime-specific features. They are defined by those features which define how power and autonomy work in the given regime. But there are, if you are a patronal autocracy, you can be a small country or a big country, for example. So Hungary and Russia are put very close to each other in this framework because they are both patronal autocracies, even though one country is very small and one is very big. The same was the case in before the regime change. Both of them were communist dictatorships, even though they were quite apart, or even they were quite different countries as they are. So I believe most of the features, and this is the real answer to your question. So the most of the things that are now happening are country specific, and they are not, this framework is not designed to reflect on that, actually. So, because I believe what we really have to take into account, first of all, is the military power of the 2 countries, then how the emerging sense of nationalism within Ukraine and how they are protecting their own country. Also within Russia, actually within Russia, there are some aspects which might be incorporated not into a triangle, but into the framework itself, such as that it seems that the framework is, the informal patronal network, it seems to not support Putin, in every way. So it seems to not, there seems to be some defection, or at least he believes that not everyone would follow him in this endeavor, because it doesn't seem to be a very beneficial one, even from the rationality of the patronal network. And therefore, Putin has to institute new measures to keep his own people in line. For instance, now he has this measure that he can confiscate the wealth of the public servants, that wealth which is on their bank account and that goes beyond their salary which they got in the last 3 years, and he can confiscate all the rest which they have. And that basically means that is a means of punishment. That is a means of designed against disloyal actors. So basically, he tries to implement these new kind of defensive mechanisms within his own framework or his own patron network, so that he can keep it together and he won't become a lame duck. So basically, that's what he's now trying to avoid.
One last question.
Yeah, I'm sorry for answering it so long.
Thank you so much for being so thorough. My question is, I think you just touched on very briefly that constitutional changes, for example, in a country that might change the dynamics of where it falls on your paradigm. When you're reevaluating how it falls, how would you just in general differentiate between a structural change like a constitutional change versus like a normal ebb and flow of politics?
Mm-hmm. Now, I believe that well, that's really hard in the matter, because that really means whether the actors are trying to play within the rules or by the rules, or they are trying to change the rules. So, and that's the real difference between the political parties of liberal democracies and the informal patronal networks, which always try to change the rules, and if they have the power to do so, they will. And as all of them did when they got the power, they changed the constitution. And basically, there are two constitutional limits, and this is the most important thing when you look at the constitutional changes. That there are two constitutional limits which prevent the establishment of patronal autocracies, and the one limit is the proportionate electoral system, and the other one is divided executive power. And these are the main limits because they prevent or they make it very difficult for one person or one network to concentrate power in one hand. If you have a proportionate electoral system, you need much more votes to get the constitutional majority in the parliament, and there is a divided executive power, then there is not a single executive which you can simply get, like the position of the president, and then all the power is concentrated in your hands, but it is divided. So it's much more difficult to constitute a single primary network if you have those features, and it's not without a reason. For instance, in Ukraine, when there were autocratic actors, and they changed the constitution, they always did so to eliminate these limits, to eliminate such limits of the divided executive, for instance. And when Orban changed the electoral law, he made it even more disproportionate than it was. So of course they realized this. They need to eliminate these limits to solidify their power or to get their power. And after the Color Revolution in Ukraine, they immediately changed the constitution back. So that's what. So the actors are very much aware of these limits, and I believe this is what needs to be considered in relation to these constitutional changes. Yeah.
Well, I think it would be time for us already to conclude. Unfortunately, I wanted to thank Bálint for this really wonderful presentation and this great contribution, I think, to the global discussion. We will be meeting again in 2 weeks, the Liberalism Study Program Seminar in 2 weeks on March 22nd with our German colleague Gunther Frankenberg, who will be presenting his latest book called Why Autocracies Have Constitutions. So we will continue one part of our discussion. Please join me in thanking Bálint for his great presentation.